Obese Bride arrived a week too late. Mountain Man said, "You're right on time for me." The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside Willow Creek's general store, its wheels crunching through February snow that had fallen thick and merciless for 3 days straight. Clara Jennings clutched her carpet bag tighter, her gloved fingers numb despite the wool. Through the frost-covered window, she could see the town, if you could call it that, little more than a scattered collection of wooden buildings huddled against the brutal Montana wind. She was 28 years old, traveling alone, and exactly 1 week late for her own wedding. The driver yanked open the door, his weathered face impassive as he assessed her. Clara had grown accustomed to that look, the momentary flicker of surprise when people saw her size, the way eyes traveled from her round face to her generous figure, calculating whether she matched whatever image they'd constructed in their minds. She'd been a mail-order bride for exactly 42 days, starting from the moment she'd answered Thomas Jennings' advertisement in the Cincinnati newspaper. Seeking honest woman for marriage, Montana territory, must be hardy, faithful, willing to work. Appearance matters less than character. Those last 5 words had given her hope. Clara stepped down into the snow, her boots sinking deep. The cold hit her like a physical blow, so different from Ohio's winter. This was a cold that had teeth. "You the Jennings bride?" A woman's voice cut through the wind. Clara turned to see a thin, sharp-featured woman in her 50s, wrapped in a worn shawl, standing in the doorway of the general store. "Yes, ma'am. Clara Jennings. Though I suppose not yet Jennings, properly speaking. I'm here to marry Thomas." "Thomas Jennings is dead." The words dropped like stones into still water. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet, though she stood perfectly still. What? Wagon accident. Week ago Tuesday. Horses spooked by a mountain lion. Went over the embankment near Devil's Pass. Found him 2 days later. The woman's voice wasn't unkind exactly, but it held no sympathy either. "You're the bride who came too late." Clara heard laughter from somewhere behind the store, men's voices, cruel and careless. "Even when a man dies, she still manages to miss the wedding," one said, loud enough to carry. More laughter followed. She stood there in the snow, her world crumbling. The money she'd spent on the train ticket, the stagecoach fare, it represented everything she'd saved in 5 years of working in her aunt's boarding house. She'd sold her mother's silver locket to afford the journey. She had 17 cents left in her purse. Is there a boarding house? Somewhere I might stay while I—" "Mrs. Patterson runs rooms above the saloon, $3 a week." The woman's eyes moved over Clara's form again. "In advance." Clara's silence was answer enough. "Well, then." The woman turned back inside. "Best you figure something out before nightfall. Temperature drops to 20 below after dark." The door closed. The stagecoach driver had already unloaded her trunk and driven away, leaving deep ruts in the snow. Clara stood alone in the street, watching her breath crystallize in the air. She found the church at the edge of town, a small wooden structure with a crooked cross atop its steeple. Outside, someone had posted a sign, "Jennings' wedding postponed." The black letters were already fading, covered in frost. Clara sank onto the church steps beneath that sign. She didn't cry. She'd used up her tears somewhere in Nebraska, on a train platform where she'd watched a mother embrace her daughter and realized with painful clarity that she had no one waiting for her anywhere. Thomas Jennings had been a stranger who'd written 3 letters describing his land, his cattle, his need for a sensible woman who wouldn't mind the isolation. She'd imagined herself as that woman. She'd imagined herself finally, belonging somewhere. Snow began to fall again, soft and silent. Clara closed her eyes and tried to remember what warmth felt like. That's a poor place to die. The voice was deep, rough as tree bark, and Clara's eyes snapped open. A man stood before her, tall and broad-shouldered, with a beard gone silver and hair the color of iron shot through with white. His eyes were gray as the winter sky, set deep beneath heavy brows. He wore buckskin and fur, a rifle slung across his back, and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged to this harsh landscape. "I'm not dying," Clara said, though even she could hear how unconvincing the words sounded. "Not yet. Give it another hour." He gestured to the darkening sky. "Storm's coming. Bad one. I have nowhere to go." "I gathered that." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You're the bride. The late bride. The wrong bride. The bride who—" Her voice cracked despite herself. "The bride who's still breathing," the man interrupted, "which puts you ahead of Thomas Jennings, all things considered." It was such a practical, almost callous observation that Clara found herself letting out a startled laugh. The man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes might have softened fractionally. "Elias Boone," he said. "I live up in the high country, got a cabin, food, firewood. You can stay until the weather breaks, and you figure out your next move." Clara looked at him, this stranger with his weathered face and unreadable eyes. Every instinct she'd been taught said this was dangerous, inappropriate, insane. A woman didn't go into the wilderness with a man she didn't know. But then, a woman also didn't travel 2,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met. And that had seemed like the sensible choice 2 months ago. "Why would you help me?" Elias shrugged, adjusting the rifle on his back. "Because I'm heading up the mountain anyway, and you'll be dead by morning if you stay here." He started to walk away, then paused. "Also, because nobody else in this town will lift a finger to help you, and I find that offensive." He moved down the street toward 2 massive horses laden with supplies. Clara watched him begin to secure the bundles, his movements efficient and practiced. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind had begun to howl through the empty spaces between buildings. She thought about Thomas Jennings, who she'd never met. She thought about the women at the general store, their cold stares and colder words. She thought about the locket she'd sold, about her mother who died believing Clara would find happiness somewhere, somehow. Then she picked up her carpetbag and followed Elias Boone toward the mountain. The journey up took hours. The trail, if you could call it that, wound through forests of pine and aspen, climbing steadily into terrain so remote that Clara couldn't hear anything human, just wind, the horses breathing, and the steady crunch of hooves through deepening snow. Elias didn't speak. He led the way on a gray gelding, with Clara following on a sturdy bay mare that seemed to know the path by heart. Clara had learned to ride as a girl, but this was different. Every step felt precarious, the mountain dropping away to her right in steep slopes that disappeared into shadow. She was exhausted and freezing by the time the cabin came into view. It sat in a small clearing ringed by towering pines, built of hand-hewn logs chinked with moss and mud. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, A lean-to stable stood nearby, and as they approached, something moved in the shadows. Clara gasped as a massive gray wolf stepped into view. "Easy," Elias said, dismounting. "That's Graytooth. Lost half his pack to hunters 3 winters ago. Showed up here bleeding, and I made the mistake of feeding him. Now he thinks he's a dog." The wolf, because it was definitely a wolf despite Elias's casual tone, regarded Clara with amber eyes. Then, apparently finding her acceptable, it padded over to Elias and pressed against his leg like an enormous cat. "He won't hurt you," Elias said, leading the horses to the stable. "Probably." Clara wasn't sure if he was joking. The cabin's interior was spare but surprisingly comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its fire casting warm light across rough-hewn furniture and shelves lined with books, traps, and various supplies. Furs covered the floor. A rifle rack held 3 weapons, all meticulously maintained. In the corner, a simple bed with thick wool blankets. "You'll take the bed," Elias said, reading her expression. "I'll sleep by the fire. Got a bedroll that served me through worse." He moved through the space with practiced efficiency, setting a kettle to boil, pulling out bread and dried meat, building up the fire until warmth began to push back the cold that had settled into Clara's bones. She stood awkwardly near the door, still clutching her bag, unsure what to do with herself. "Sit," Elias said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "You look like you're about to collapse." Clara sat. The chair creaked under her weight, and she saw Elias notice. But he said nothing, just handed her a tin cup of coffee so strong and hot it almost burned her tongue. It was the best thing she'd ever tasted. They ate in silence. Elias seemed comfortable with it, and Clara was too tired to make conversation. When she'd finished, he showed her where he kept water for washing, the necessary behind the cabin, the way to bank the fire at night. "Storm's going to last 3, maybe 4 days," he said. "After that, we'll see about getting you back to town if that's what you want." "What would I do there?" Elias shrugged. "Not my place to say, but you seem like a woman who's used to working. Town always needs cooks, laundresses, teachers for the children. You could find a way." Clara looked around the cabin, at the dust on the shelves, the mending piled in a basket, the dishes stacked haphazardly. "Or I could be useful here, while I'm staying, I mean. Fair exchange for room and board." Something flickered in Elias's eyes, surprise maybe, or approval. "Suit yourself." That night, Clara lay in Elias Boone's bed, buried under furs that smelled of pine and smoke, and listened to the storm rage outside. Through the firelight, she could see Elias's silhouette as he sat by the hearth, Graytooth's head resting on his knee. The man was reading. She could see the book in his weathered hands, and the sight was so unexpectedly gentle that Clara felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. She'd come west to be someone's wife, to have a purpose, to belong. Thomas Jennings was dead, and with him, that particular dream. But lying here in this remote cabin, listening to a stranger turn pages while a wolf slept beside him, Clara felt the first stirring of something she couldn't quite name. Not happiness, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of it. The storm lasted 5 days, not 4. Clara woke the second morning to find Elias already gone, out checking traps or hunting. She wasn't sure which. Graytooth remained by the fire, watching her with those unsettling amber eyes. She got to work. The cabin was clean, functionally, but it lacked the kind of order Clara had learned in her years managing her aunt's boarding house. She swept, organized, mended the holes in 2 shirts she found in the basket. She discovered sourdough starter in a crock by the window and used it to make bread, the smell filling the cabin with warmth. When Elias returned near dusk, carrying 2 rabbits and covered in snow, he stopped in the doorway and simply stared. "You didn't have to," he started. "Fair exchange," Clara interrupted. "You're keeping me alive. This is what I can offer in return." He cleaned the rabbits in silence, but Clara noticed how his eyes kept moving around the cabin, taking in the changes. That evening, when she served him stew she'd made from dried vegetables and salt pork she'd found in his stores, he ate 3 bowls. "You're a good cook," he said finally. "I'm competent." Clara had never been comfortable with compliments. Food is chemistry and timing. I can follow instructions. Most people can't. Elias leaned back, studying her. "You worked in Ohio?" "My aunt's boarding house, after my parents died. 15 years of cooking, cleaning, keeping books." She traced a finger around the rim of her bowl. "She died last November. Her son inherited the house, and he had a wife who didn't want me there, so I looked for another option." "Mail-order bride." Clara nodded. "I'm 28 years old, Mr. Boone, past the age where men come calling, and I'm—" She gestured at herself, the roundness of her face, her generous proportions. Not the type who inspires romantic interest. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Thomas Jennings was a fool in many ways, but he was practical. He needed a partner, not a decoration. He would have been lucky to have you." The words were simple, matter-of-fact, but they hit Clara with unexpected force. She felt heat rising to her face and bent her head to hide it. "Tell me about you," she said, changing the subject. "The town speaks of you like you're some kind of legend, the mountain man who saved the hunters last year." Elias's expression darkened. Town talks too much. Still, how does a man end up living alone in the wilderness with a wolf for company? He was quiet so long Clara thought he wouldn't answer. The fire crackled. Outside, wind howled through the pines. Finally, Elias spoke. "I was a scout, Army, during the Indian Wars. Spent 15 years tracking, fighting, watching good men die for bad reasons." His voice was flat, emotionless, but Clara heard the pain underneath. "Had a wife once, Mary, left her in St. Louis while I served. Came back in '76 to find she'd died of cholera. 4 months dead, and nobody thought to tell me. I'm sorry. Life is sorry. People die. Wars end. What's left is whatever you can salvage from the wreckage." He looked at her then, his gray eyes intense. "I came up here because people break things. Out here there's just weather and animals and the land. Simpler." "Lonelier," Clara said softly. "Yes." No denial, no justification, just that single word, heavy with truth. Clara thought about the life she'd left, the years of invisible labor, of being tolerated but not wanted. "I understand that kind of solitude, the kind where you're surrounded by people but still entirely alone." Elias nodded slowly. "Then you understand why the quiet up here feels like mercy." They sat in comfortable silence after that, the kind that forms between people who recognize something familiar in each other's isolation. When Clara finally retired to bed, she heard Elias moving around the cabin, banking the fire, settling in. His presence felt solid, reassuring in a way she hadn't expected. The days developed a rhythm. Elias would rise before dawn, check the animals, hunt or trap. Clara would cook, clean, mend, and slowly transform the cabin from a survivalist's shelter into something approaching a home. She found fabric in a trunk and made curtains. She organized the books, surprisingly numerous, covering everything from Shakespeare to agricultural manuals, into something like a library. She taught herself to make soap from rendered fat and lye. Elias, for his part, began to emerge from his shell of isolation. He talked more, told her stories of his scouting days, the strange beauty of the plains, the complex honor systems of the tribes he'd fought against. He taught her to read weather in the sky, to identify animal tracks in snow, to load and fire a rifle. "Out here, you need to know how to protect yourself," he said, positioning her hands on the weapon. "I won't always be around." The thought of being without him sent an unexpected pang through Clara's chest. She'd only known Elias Boone for 2 weeks, but his steady presence had become an anchor. She looked forward to his return each evening, to the quiet conversations by the fire, to the way his severe face softened fractionally when he tasted something she cooked. One night, over a dinner of venison stew and biscuits, Elias asked the question Clara had been dreading. "Storm's breaking tomorrow. Road to town should be passable in a few days. You've been thinking about what comes next?" Clara set down her spoon. "I've been avoiding thinking about it." "Can't avoid reality forever." "I know." She looked around the cabin, at the curtains she'd hung, the mended shirts folded on the shelf, the bread rising by the fire. "I suppose I should go back to town, find work somehow, send word to Ohio, see if my cousin might send money for train fare back." "Is that what you want?" The question hung in the air. Clara found she couldn't answer honestly because the truth was complicated and frightening. What she wanted was to stay here, in this warm cabin, with this quietly kind man who never looked at her with disappointment or pity. But wanting something didn't make it possible or proper. "What I want doesn't much matter," she said finally. "I have no claim on your hospitality beyond the storm." Elias studied her, his expression unreadable. "What if you did?" Clara's heart stuttered. "What?" "You work harder than any hired hand I could afford. You cook better than anyone I've known. This cabin has been just a place to sleep for years, but you've made it—" He paused, searching for words. "You've made it feel like a home." "Mr. Boone, Elias, Elias!" She forced herself to meet his eyes. "What exactly are you proposing?" "That you stay, not as a guest, as—" He gestured vaguely. "A partner. You need a place. I need help. It's practical." Practical. The same word Thomas Jennings had used in his letters, but this felt different. Not a stranger's advertisement, but an offer from someone who knew her, had seen her at her worst and most vulnerable, and still wanted her here. "People in town would talk," Clara said. "They talk anyway. I stopped caring what people thought 20 years ago. It wouldn't be proper, a woman and a man, unmarried, living together." Elias's jaw tightened. "Then marry me." The words dropped like stones into still water. Clara felt the world tilt. "You can't be serious." "Why not? You came west to be a bride. I'm offering you the position." His voice was rough, almost defensive. "I'm too old for you, I know, and I'm not an easy man. But I'd treat you fair, and you'd never go hungry or cold. That's more than most marriages start with." Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. Outside, moonlight turned the snow to silver. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why would you want to marry me?" because you're the first person in 15 years who's made me remember what it feels like to come home to someone." His voice was closer now. He'd followed her across the room. "Because you're honest and capable and stronger than you know. Because when I think about you leaving, about this cabin going back to what it was before you came—" He trailed off. Clara turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not beautiful, Elias. I'm fat and plain and past my youth. Men have always looked through me, not at me. I can't give you children. The doctor told me that years ago. I'm not a prize. I'm just me." Elias reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and wiped a tear from her cheek with his calloused thumb. "I've seen beautiful things die in this wilderness, Clara. Beauty doesn't keep you warm. It doesn't mend a torn shirt or make bread in a snowstorm. It doesn't sit by the fire and make silence feel like companionship instead of isolation." His gray eyes held hers. "You came here broken, and you pieced yourself back together. That's the kind of strength I respect. That's what I want beside me." Clara couldn't speak. She'd spent 28 years believing she was too much and never enough, existing in the margins of other people's lives. And here was this man, this rough, isolated, unexpectedly gentle man, looking at her like she was essential. "I don't know if I can be what you need," she whispered. "You already are." The kiss happened slowly, tentatively, as if both of them were relearning something they'd forgotten. Elias's lips were warm against hers, his beard soft. Clara's hands found his shoulders solid and steady. When they broke apart, she was trembling. "Say yes," Elias murmured against her forehead. "Stay with me. Be my wife." Clara thought of the church sign in town, the wedding that never was. She thought of Thomas Jennings, dead in a ravine, and the cruel laughter of strangers. She thought of the woman she'd been when she arrived, desperate, dismissed, invisible. And she thought of who she was becoming, someone who could survive a blizzard, shoot a rifle, transform a cabin into a home. Someone worthy of being chosen, not out of necessity, but out of genuine want. "Yes," she said. They planned to go to town the following week, after the snow melted enough for safe travel. Elias would speak to the circuit preacher, and they'd have a simple ceremony. But fate, as Clara was learning, rarely cooperated with plans. 3 days before they were set to leave, Great Tooth began growling. The wolf stood at the cabin door, hackles raised, teeth bared. Elias grabbed his rifle immediately. "Someone's coming," he said. "Stay inside." But Clara followed him onto the porch, her own rifle, the one he'd taught her to use, clutched in shaking hands. Through the trees she could see movement, men on horseback, at least 5 of them. They emerged into the clearing, led by a man Clara recognized from town, Cyrus Jennings, Thomas's younger cousin. He had Thomas's sandy hair, but none of the warmth she'd glimpsed in her dead fiancé's letters. "There's the bride," Cyrus called out, his voice carrying across the snow. "We've come to collect what's ours." "She's not yours," Elias said, his voice flat and dangerous. "Turn around and ride back to town." "Thomas promised her marriage," Cyrus continued, dismounting. "With him dead, I'm the head of the Jennings family now. His debts and obligations transfer to me, including her." Clara felt sick. "I'm not property." "You're a mail-order bride who was paid for." Cyrus pulled out a paper. "Thomas sent you train fare, $40. That's a legal contract. You owe service to the Jennings family one way or another." "The hell she does," Elias said. "And who are you?" Some mountain hermit who thinks he can steal another man's bride? Cyrus smiled, cruel and cold. Word in town is you've been keeping her up here all alone. Improper, that is. Scandalous. The kind of thing that ruins a woman's reputation permanently. My reputation was ruined the moment I arrived a week late to my own wedding, Clara said, stepping forward. You want to use that against me? Fine, but I'm not going with you. Cyrus's expression hardened. Then we'll take you. What happened next occurred in heartbeats. Cyrus moved toward Clara. Elias shifted to block him. One of the other men, she never saw which, fired. The shot cracked through the clearing, and Elias staggered backward, clutching his shoulder as blood bloomed through his shirt. Clara screamed. Gray Tooth launched himself at the nearest horse, causing it to rear and throw its rider. Chaos erupted, men shouting, horses panicking, the wolf's snarls mixing with human cries. Clara raised her rifle. She'd never shot at a person before, didn't know if she could. But as Cyrus grabbed for her arm and Elias fell to his knees in the snow, something inside her crystallized into perfect, cold clarity. She fired into the air. The shot echoed across the mountain loud enough to cause an avalanche of snow to slide from the nearby pine branches. Everyone froze. The next one won't be a warning, Clara said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. You shot an unarmed man. You're on his property. And I have 4 more bullets that say you'll leave now, or you'll explain to the sheriff why you committed murder over a debt that was never legal in the first place. That money was a gift, not a purchase. I'm a human being, not livestock. And if you don't leave right now, I'll shoot you myself and let the wolves clean up what's left. She meant it. Cyrus saw it in her eyes. This isn't over, he spat. But he mounted his horse, and the others followed. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving only hoof prints in the bloody snow. Clara dropped the rifle and fell to her knees beside Elias. The bullet had gone through his shoulder, messy, but not fatal if she could stop the bleeding. Inside, she ordered, her voice shaking now. Come on, help me get you inside. She half carried, half dragged him through the door. Gray Tooth followed, whining anxiously. Clara tore strips from her petticoat, packed the wound, tied it tight. Her hands were covered in Elias's blood, but she worked steadily, remembering the basic medicine her aunt had taught her years ago. You should have let them take me, Clara whispered as she worked. You're hurt because of me. No. Elias's voice was weak, but firm. His good hand caught hers. I'm alive because of you. You stood your ground. You protected us both. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she tied off the bandage. I could have lost you. I finally found someone who sees me, who wants me, and I could have... But you didn't. He pulled her down beside him, his blood soaking into her dress. You saved me, Clara, my fierce, brave bride. She kissed him then desperately, tasting salt and fear and relief. When they broke apart, Elias was smiling despite the pain. Still want to marry me? He asked. Even though I come with enemies and bullet holes? Clara laughed through her tears. Especially because of that. It means you fought for me. Always will. Elias healed slowly but steadily. Clara tended him with fierce devotion, changing bandages, forcing him to rest, standing guard with the rifle by the door in case Cyrus returned. He didn't, though they heard rumors from a trader who passed through 2 weeks later that the sheriff had words with Cyrus about shooting a man over a disputed contract. The matter was dropped officially, though everyone knew it was really the story of Clara standing her ground that made Cyrus back down. Nobody wanted to tangle with a woman who'd protect her man with a loaded rifle. Spring came slowly to the high country. Snow melted in patches, revealing the first brave shoots of wildflowers. Birds returned, their songs filling the morning air, and one bright April morning, Elias declared himself well enough to travel. They didn't go to town. Instead, Elias took Clara on a different path, higher into the mountains, to a clearing where a waterfall cascaded over smooth rocks into a crystal pool. Wild flowers carpeted the ground, yellow bells, lupine, Indian paintbrush. "This is where I come when I need to remember the world can be beautiful," Elias said. "Seemed right to bring you here." From his pack, he pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a ring carved from wood, simple but elegant, two interlocking circles forming one continuous band. "Made it while I was healing," he said, suddenly awkward. "Gave me something to do besides go crazy being bedridden." Clara took the ring with shaking hands. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever made for her. "No church," Elias continued. "No preacher. Just you, me, and whatever God lives in these mountains. But if you'll have me, I want to make this official. I want to call you wife, and mean it with everything I am." Clara looked at this man who'd saved her from a snowstorm and offered her shelter when no one else would, who'd defended her against men who wanted to treat her like property, who'd looked at her, really looked at her, and seen someone worth loving. "I came west to be a bride," she said, sliding the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "I was a week late for that wedding, but I think I was exactly on time for this one." Elias pulled her close, and they stood there in the clearing as the waterfall sang and the sun warmed their faces. No witnesses except the mountains and the sky. But Clara had never felt more married than she did in that moment. "You were right on time for me," Elias murmured against her hair. "Right when I'd given up hoping." They built their life together slowly, day by day. Clara expanded the garden, learned to preserve meat for winter, became a crack shot with the rifle. Elias taught her to track, to read the land, to move through the wilderness with confidence. They traded with the occasional travelers who passed through, and word spread about the mountain man and his formidable wife. Years later, when people asked Clara about her wedding, she'd smile and say she'd married twice, once to a dead man in a town that didn't want her, and once to a living man in a clearing full of wildflowers. The first wedding made her a joke. The second made her whole. She'd been the bride who arrived too late, who'd been mocked and dismissed and turned away. But Elias was right. She'd been exactly on time for the life she was meant to live. Not perfect, not easy, but honest and real and hers. Every spring, on the anniversary of that day in the clearing, they'd return to the waterfall. Elias would bring her wildflowers, and Clara would make his favorite meal. They'd sit together as the sun set over the mountains, two people who'd found each other in the unlikeliest of circumstances. "Still glad you didn't freeze to death on those church steps?" Elias would ask, teasing, and Clara would kiss him and answer, "Best decision I never made." Because sometimes being late to the wrong thing means arriving exactly on time for the right one.